Hi everybody. This little short video is just uh, a link to uh, the workshop where we're going to be working outside, but thinking very hard about color. In other words, we're not necessarily going to apply the color that we see out there. In other words, as artists, we want to maybe introduce other color schemes, if you like, to change the mood and create a different sense of the place, perhaps. Now, the thing about this is there are millions, as you know, of variations of color harmony, and there's so much to learn about color harmony and color use that it would take many, many, many sessions. So the idea that I have is to boil it down to three aspects of controlling color. Okay, so that's the essential bit. And I think it's just a good way to get started, to get used to the idea that it isn't actually spontaneous. When we see those great paintings where the color appears to have been applied spontaneously and it just all works like a lovely piece of music, and you think, oh, it's easy. And we try that, as you know, we will struggle because if we are not applying rules, the artists who do that, just like great musicians, they can play jazz, play all over the place, but they're playing from the point of view of knowledge. So this is what I'm trying to do and get you to think about. What I'm going to do, hopefully, is try to uh, bring up this slide show here, and hopefully you're seeing uh, what I see. Hopefully, so some methods of controlling the color. Okay, and we're going to focus on three areas: monochromatic, use of neutral colors, or if you like, desaturated colors, and the use of analogous harmony. Okay, so I want to show you some examples. Apologies for not including the names of the artists. I really should, and I do apologize for that. These are um, images that I've gleaned from the internet, okay? But this first one is a monochromatic harmony, the simplest, if you like, form of harmony, if you think about it. One color, one single color, and variations of that color, lighter and darker, and that's it. And this little painting seems to be a little watercolor. Uh, it can be watercolor, it can be oils, whatever. But you can see what the artist done here. They're just using this ultramarine or purplish blue, and they're just diluting it in various forms to create lighter and darker. And basically, that's it. They've got the beach scene with a little sea, waves, and a lovely big sky. And it has a mood. It has a mood because it's blue, it's purple. Purple is and blues are very emotional colors. So one of the things about a monochromatic harmony is when you use a color like blue, it has that immediate power of mood and atmosphere. Likewise, if it used red, it would be a different, perhaps an angrier, more threatening image, but it's just based on that one single color. Here now, we're now looking at what I would call neutral colors. And I know on screens this can be very hard to see. Um, so hopefully you can see some of it. Uh, it's Ron Davies is, I think, the name of the artist who did this. I think it's some time ago. But if you look at the colors of the land and the grasses and the trees, the sky, if you look really hard, you will see greens and reddish earths and pinks and maybe even blues, but they're just about those colors and maybe hardly those colors at all. You can just about identify it and say that's kind of greenish, that's kind of brownish, you know. And the reason for that is these colors have been drained and desaturated. So they're not a pure green straight from the tube, or they're not even quite a rich green. Even if it's mixed, it's still quite rich. They are very, very muddy versions of those colors. The painting relies more in a way on light. It's almost like a monochromatic painting, like we saw a moment ago, but it's not monochromatic because it has more than one color in it. So this is an example, if you like, of really lovely neutral colors. Here, another by John Singer Sargent, Seascape, all using very limited color. There are hints of yellowish colors. There's hints of pinks and blues and things in there. But again, they are gray versions of all of those colors. They're dulled down versions of all those colors. go to this. Again, I can't remember the artist, a Russian artist. I think it's actually called the Rooks Are Coming. Um, and this is an interesting one. It's kind of monochromatic or kind of neutral. And what's interesting about it, if you look at the bottom two-thirds of that picture, you will see that essentially it's like the previous ones, very muddy, very earthy. There's hints of color, but just hints. But then the artist up here at the top throws in a little brighter blue. Now it's not an intense blue, but it's brighter than the rest. And suddenly that gives a different lift to that picture. That blue energizes the picture. In other words, throws in a little bit of an accent. So essentially it's a neutral painting, but it's been given a lift with that little accent. And this brings me into the whole idea of thinking about proportions of color. So sometimes one of the biggest mistakes we make is we put the same amount of each color on, and we have the same blue, same green, same red, and none of them win the battle. Here in this picture, the neutrals are winning the battle, but the blue is just there as a little bit of a contrast, something to give it a lift, okay? So this is basically just a little explanation of the way we can adjust colors. If we choose, for instance, to use what I would call a neutral color harmony, in other words, the colors that we use, yes, they may be blue for a sky or green for the grass or whatever, but they will be desaturated versions of those colors, neutralized, very earthy, grayish versions. So we're not using pure color. So that gives all of our picture, if you like, an overall harmony. In other words, that's what all the colors have in common, that they all have that neutral gray quality. So with that in mind, just to show you what I mean, here there's some color is in these little trays here, and this color up here is a pure ultramarine, a little bit of water in there. And just if I put that on to my paper, you can see obviously how strong that is. It's really quite a strong color. And I could do a sky like that if I wanted. I could dilute it a little bit and it would be all right. But if I take that same color, and what I've done here is add a little orange. So from this little tray here, just added a little bit of this orange here. Tiny, tiny amount actually. And it doesn't take much very often to change it. So that blue that I had has become this blue, or this color, which is, you know, it is bluish, but it's not quite as vibrant. You see there's a paleness, a grayness to that. If I add a little more orange, beg your pardon, which I'm doing now on the end of the brush, add a little more, you can see, I hope, that it will become even more so, more grayed. So, but we're still staying in what we would call a blue spectrum, a blue area, okay? So in other words, when I come to paint and I'm saying, well, I want the sky, I choose a bluish color, I'm going to consciously say, well, I'm going to make sure it's desaturated color. So, and I'm going to do that with all of the colors that I look at. For example, again, if we swing this round, we've got this green. So we have this, it's fairly vibrant yellowish green. Sorry, I'm just going to get a little tissue here. So if I put this green on, you'll see, again, it's fairly strong, fairly rich, but you know, it's the sort of color you may see occasionally in landscape. However, if I was then to take the complementary of green, which is red, and especially this yellowish green would be more like a deeper red. So I'm going to put a little bit of, actually I've got it over here, a little bit of crimson into that. So I'm going to take a little bit of crimson on the end of the brush. You can see it there. And you can see actually how little there is. I've just touched the little tray there with the crimson. I'm going to drop that in here, okay, and see how we go on. You can see, I don't know if you can see that slightly grayer. What I'm going to do is add another little bit. And there's no formula for this. On the day if you're doing this, it's up to you. You can see how that green has become that. And again, maybe if I push it a little further, another little bit of red, you can actually see this tray of water changing. You can see how the green is moving from that to an earthier version, if you like, likewise that. So using that principle with all of the colors or the colors I choose, I know that there'll be neutrality about the colors. So what I'm going to do is try to put that onto our little picture itself. What I'm doing now is I'm going to block this in. I have a loose drawing made of the little picture that we had looked at before, but I'm dropping in this bluish color, the neutralized version of the blue, if you like, in this area here. And I know there are going to be little clouds and things over here, but I want to just occupy large areas to let you see how that changes. Then I'm going to jump down to the lower area and say, well, this is where the greens were. And some of the greens were quite vibrant, but because I've added the red into this, this will kill that off. And obviously I can build up stronger versions of it with less water. You know, it's the same sort of thing there. But the colors are not necessarily, if you like, in your face. For example, I know that the little hills in the background were a bluish tint. So I happen to have a little strong ultramarine there, but I'm going to throw in, as I did before, a little orange, except this time there's going to be much less water in there. So the result with the orange into the blue is something like this. You can see this color that I'm getting here along that area. So it's a cold color, but it really is very gray. And perhaps then you might find in front of that, just since I'm using this color, I might take this same color just as it is, sorry for the shaking there, and just dilute it slightly, and then allow that to be the color of the hills or the mountains in front of that. So we have that sort of thing going on. And again, you see how neutral that color is. So we have colors like that. What I'm going to do also is the clouds, for example, had what I would call a purplish tint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make up a little purple in a moment, add the complementary and put it on. So we'll just pause this for a second. So I've just been making up here a little mauvey sort of color. I'm just going to put that over there for a second. But that's what it looks like. That when I take that little piece of paint there and paint that on, beg your pardon, you can see that's the sort of color that I'm getting. So it's a slightly bluish mauvey color. So if I want to desaturate that slightly, muddy it up in other words, then I add the complementary to that, which in this case is yellow. So I'm going to put a little tiny bit of lemon yellow into this, which again, if I just show you, I'll bring this piece of paper, put that beside that, you see what's happening. That's it's not very dilute, mind you. I'll have to dilute it a little bit, just let you see that a wee bit better. So you can see that sort of color. It's turned that to that. So it's a purpliness, but it's a grayer purple, okay? So what I'm going to do is just drop that in there. I know I'm working quite fast, but it's sort of really just and just let that bleed out there, okay? So we have these little clouds and things going on around that area. This is mostly water I'm putting on here, really, you know. But you can see that there's a hint of purple, but it's not very severe, okay? And some of these clouds come out there like that and so on. I mean, this is really good, a loose sketch. What I really hope that you're seeing is the relationship of colors there. There's blueness there, there's kind of purplishness, there's sort of a greeny yellowishness there, but they're just off those colors. They're not absolutely pure. And I guess if I was going back to the greens and things like that, I could begin to introduce the stronger greens in there. So I might take, for example, I'm just going to move that out of the way so I can show you this. I'm going to add a wee bit more green into this pot. You can probably hear me scratching away there, but you can see this green right there, which I had desaturated with red. So I'm adding more green to this at the minute. And I'm gonna then add extra red. So there's the red going in to this green here. This time I'm adding much more red. So in theory, this will muddy this up even more, which means when I put these colors, do you see the neutral quality of that? So I can put, these sort of colors on right there over that. But none of these colors are what we would call pure rich. So in other words, the minute we introduce a complementary to a color, we kill off that color and we stop it from being severe, if that's what we want. You can see there how that little area has just killed all that down a little bit. And if we do it to all of the colors, then there'd be similarity to what's going on in the actual painting itself. I might even take this purple with a little more yellow here, what I used for the clouds, and maybe just go back over this and say, well, I want to cool that down a wee bit. But whatever I do, I'm doing it with neutral colors, and I'm not going straight for the color immediately, as it were, on on here, so I'm taking time before it hits the paper to muddy it down a little bit. And in that respect, we can start to create moods. And again, we can increase the mood. We can increase the drama by mixing more complementaries until these colors basically become very, very muted. So you can see there I'm dropping some of these colors on. It's hard to see what color that is. But this little set of colors that I've made up here is allowing me to do that. So in a sense, it's not a bad idea to have pre-made colors and then play around with those. So in other words, you're not starting anywhere with a primary color, a pure yellow, pure green, pure red, whatever. You're starting on your palette with these neutral colors, and then you can mix them together, which is what I'm starting to do here. As I'm speaking there, I'm just playing with these and thinking, oh, there's a wee bit of that. That will mix with that. I know that these will all be neutral now because they've all been affected by what I've done. So now I can play around and mix them in and do all sorts, knowing that there's something similar about them. There's this grey here. Maybe I drop some of that in there. That's the dregs of that purple that I had earlier on. Drop a little bit over there and maybe make something more of those clouds. I say, apologies, I'm working very fast here, but probably I'm enjoying it too much. But you can see that we know there's a certain quietness to those colors. They're not severe. Then, and this is the interesting thing, and I know this is very wet, so it might be difficult to do, but then this is where color balance can come into play, that we can create a scheme like this and say, yeah, we've got this quiet, neutral sort of feel, and then we might say, well, hold on, we just want to give it a spark. How do we give it a spark? Well, maybe we do allow ourselves, and this is going to be a wee bit risky perhaps, but this is what it's about. I'm mixing up a stronger blue and just dropping it in there and saying, well, I know that wasn't blue in the picture. It doesn't matter. I'm going to turn this into a lake or something. So that sudden little spark of blue ignites that picture. Suddenly there's one bit that's sharper than the rest, and therefore it gives a wee bit of energy. If I keep on putting too much blue, then the balance will shift the wrong way. So it's a bit like buying a coat, a green coat or something, and then saying, right, I want to wear a flower with it, or I want to wear something with it which is going to lift it. And the flower might be a tiny little thing, or the jewelry might be a tiny little thing, but it will give it a lift. And that tiny little bit of blue, or relatively small blue, lifts this as well. And we can play with that, if you like, all day. But hopefully that will give you some idea of preparing like this, colors that are already muted down. So the green is muddied up, the blue is muddied up, the purple is muddied up, and everything else is muddied up. And then off I can go and play around with that. I thought I would actually do a little experiment with this picture. I took a photograph of it. You can see now that it's dried, you know, hopefully then these quiet colors that we talked about, accented by that colder blue there. But sometimes just when you're exploring color, like exploring anything else, think about taking a few risks with things, you know, try something different and so on. So what I'm thinking here is, if we unify this even more, in other words, we pull it all together so that there's less difference between the colors, even less. Let's see what happens with that. And one way to experiment with that is just to glaze or wash the whole thing. In the case of watercolor, would be a wash. And what I have, I've still got these tubs of color that I was using earlier. This was one of the ones I think I was using in the sky, but I think I'd added some of the neutral green into it. So it's really quite a mucky version of a couple of these things mixed together. But they're all from the color scheme I started with. So what I thought might be quite interesting is just to take some of this and just glaze entirely over this picture, okay, just or rather wash over it and let it dry and see how that changes it. You know, it will destroy the colors, which is exactly what I'm thinking about here. So it might be very shiny and glossy at the minute. Even when it's wet, I hope you can see what's happened there, that it has brought down the key, the tonal thing. Overall, it's got that bit darker, obviously because of put darker paint on it, but it's just changed the mood of the picture. It's grayer overall. It's so I'm always trying to get you to think about mood as you're thinking about color, rather than just color for its own sake. Hopefully now this will also back up what I'm saying about creating neutral colors before you begin. So if you're using oils or acrylics, um, you can do this as well. You can do it with watercolors. It can be a wee bit more difficult to prepare lumps of paint with watercolor, as it were, which is why in the case of watercolor, I think it might be possibly even easier if you happen to be using tubes of watercolor. It can be quite fiddly going through the little pans to mix up a batch, as I was doing in these big tubs before you start, but it can be done, as you've seen. So if though you're painting with acrylics or oils, you can do it a different way. So what I've done here, I have my three primary colors there, red, yellow, blue, and beside those I've made up complementary colors, so green, purple, and orange down here. So in other words, if I have red and I put it on my canvas or whatever, obviously it's going to be like that, fairly strong. That's okay. Um, if I take that red, I'll take a little bit over here and add a little green. And many of you I know who are doing these workshops have seen me doing this a million times. So, but there's no harm in repeating it. That tiny bit of green there is going into the red, and you might even be able to see a change already. You know, between that and that. Hopefully you do actually. I'm going to put a wee bit more in. So really what I begin to get is something different. I'm going to put that beside that. And you can see that the red there is bordering on what we might say a brownish red, which is what it is. I suppose it's a neutral red, a neutralized red because of the green. And obviously the more green I add, the more earthy that becomes. So if I had a batch of that prepared, and it's up to you. You could put more green in and just experiment. But if you had a batch of neutralized red, then we take yellow, do the same thing. Yellow and purple can be an odd one, but you can see there I'm scooping a little bit of purple. Sometimes in the case of yellow, it takes very little to change it. You can see there already, look, that tiny touch of purple turns into this strange, it's a sort of green really, you know, but it's still essentially yellow. So there's what we get when we do that. It's a mustardy yellow as opposed to this over here, which is a pure lemon yellow. So there's my red, there's my yellow, and then if I take my blue, scoop some blue. You can maybe choose to make up more of it before you get started, especially if you're working with oils. You know they'll stay wet. With acrylics it might dry quickly, so you may not want to make lots of it up, and then suddenly, time passes and it dries up. It's a bit of a waste. So there's the blue. Unfortunately, there's a tiny bit of yellow going in there, but hopefully it won't be too affecting. There's my little bit of orange, complementary to blue. Stirred some of that in. That was very little, but actually I'll just put that over there to let you see. You see that it's turned it to what we once called like a petrol blue. I'm going to put more orange into this. Eventually it will turn a greenish colour, of course, because the orange has yellow in it. So, that's entirely up to you, but you can see what we still have is a cold colour. It's in the area of blues, colds. You have in the area of yellows, in the area of reds. So if you say, well, these are my primaries, then if I was to mix here, for example, take a little of this mustardy yellow and a little of my bluish colour and stir that, I'll get greens, but I'll get a different sort of green. It's an earthy, dull green. If I mix, I haven't very much of the yellow left, but if I mix some of the red and some of this mustard, I'll use some of that actually into that, I'll get sort of an orange, but you can see that orange is much more earthy, browny, relating to this. So all of this set of colors are very different that we're going to get. So if you keep mixing them in your painting will be muddier, neutral, more quiet, if you like. The more you desaturate the colors at the beginning, the more quiet and mucky they'll be. And it's quite an exciting thing, to say to yourself, I'm going to really push it. I mean, for example, if I take the dregs of that purple, get as much of it as I can there, and put lots of it into the yellow, I get a very odd thing going on. And of course, remember too, that we haven't even considered whites. And of course, when we start to add whites to all of these, you'll get variations of that as well. So all we're saying is, before you start to paint, think about a red, yellow, blue, and add the complementary into each, and have a batch of those neutral colours ready, and they will become your palette. Let's think about analogous colour now. Analogous colours are any set of colours which are close to each other on the colour wheel. You can see this illustration here. Any segment, like a segment of an orange. In this case, it's red. Beg your pardon, go back there. In this case, it's red, orange, orange. It can go on to orange, yellow, yellow, and so on. You can see that. But in this case, it's those three variations: red, reddish orange, and orange. You can have what's called a close analogous color, which is maybe just two or three of those colors, which is what we've got here. There's also what they call an extended analogous color harmony, whereby you would maybe have more. In other words, you might go a little further around and have 4 in the segment, or maybe 5. But that's what we have here is a good example of just a straightforward analogous. You can see on the right hand side here little examples of analogous harmony. So that's the one we're looking at the minute in the segment. Then you would have these orange, yellow, 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 green. So they're the next segment down, and so on and so forth. You can have these. And they're very close knit harmony. You're not using many paints here, but it's very effective. So we look at this picture. This is a great example of that. So unlike the previous ones, they're not muddy and neutral. They're quite rich colors in some ways. This little landscape with clouds, but you can see the quite strong yellows, oranges, orange reds. So they're in that little segment of range of color. What you notice also, going back to this business of proportion, look at the right-hand side of this picture. You have the flash of blue. Blue is a complementary color of orange, remember? So blue will give energy to oranges, but blue is not dominant. It's the predominantly orange reds warms, but the one little bit of blue helps make that more so. And you look further down and you'll see hints of purples, little hints of purple, violet here and there in tiny amounts, but they're complementing the yellow. Purple is the complementary of yellow. So this artist has used a knowledge of analogous color as well as their knowledge of complementary color to give that analogous color even more bite, even more spark, if you like. Here's another example. Same sort of range of color. Reddish, reddish orange, orange, maybe a bit of yellow all around the segment. But do you notice over the left side, the artist has flooded in little bits of a purplish, mauvey, sort of a bluey purple. That's a great, terrible description. But you can see that that purpley color, which relates to the yellow, complements yellow, and the bluish tints, which maybe relate to the orange. So there's no, for example, green in there. Uh, there's no really strong blue. And so therefore the artist again is using a knowledge of color. So if I can return to me, okay, there are some examples of how those types of color systems work within landscape. So when you're out there, you can apply those. But what I want to do next is very quickly show you how to prepare in order to apply those in real life when you're out there with your paints, your palette, and all of the things that are actually going on. Okay.
Okay, well, what I'm going to do here is change this little watercolor that I did. I thought I would use it as the drawing, if you like, for the next part. And the next part I want to talk about is using the analogous harmony. In other words, colors that are side by side in the color wheel. So if you look at the color wheel, you'll see that they go in segments, and we've looked at that earlier. So in this case, the range that I've chosen is a set of colors going from blue, blue-green, green, yellowish green. And then that's that segment of 4 that exists in the color wheel. If we kept on going, the next one would be yellow. But I'm going to just work with those 4 steps, if you like, plus a little bit of white. And what I'm going to do here is use this color harmony on top of this. I'm going to paint on top of that with the acrylics using this scheme. And so if we look here, we've obviously got, we want a light tone up at the top. We have darker tones here, then slightly lighter and so on. So the tones in our little pre-study, if you like, are established. What I'm going to do is try and apply the colors to fit that, if you like, and watch what happens. So in other words, what I'm going to do is where there's blue here, and I'll just go ahead and start. Obviously that's a very, very strong blue. So what I'm going to do is say, okay, yes, we're going to use blue, but tonally it's a very, very pale blue. So you can see there I'm mixing this up to this very, very pale color, and I'm going to put that on there. So it kind of soaks in a little bit to begin with because of the I'm working directly on watercolor paper here. Maybe even more white. So as I'm painting this, I'm not mixing it scientifically and carefully here and there perfect and then applying it. I'm being loose and free and painterly. I want to try and make the thing look exciting and painterly, but at the same time try to follow a certain rule of harmony here. So I'm going to work up there. We're going to put something else around there in the clouds in due course, but what we've got there is a palish bluish tone in there. Okay, take that on down to the bottom maybe here for the moment anyway. So it's kind of like a colouring in exercise. It's a colour harmony exercise anyway. We'll go ahead and go over that because we can cover that later anyway. So we have this established light blue now. Then we might say, okay, let's assume that we make our colours go from warm to cold. So blue being the coldest, this yellow green being the warmest. So if we follow that principle, and we'll see where that takes us. So that suggests that the next color we want here will be something like this. What we also realize is that that's a darker tone than that. So of course our green will be darker than this. And the green already is darker, it's quite dark. Maybe I don't want it quite as dark as that. So I'm going to put a tiny little bit of white in there. Maybe overdone it there, you know. Something like that, maybe. You can see this color here. And put this in. So it's a little bit darker, but we'll go with it. Using a fairly big brush here, a relatively big brush compared to the canvas or the board, if you like, you know. And we'll bang that in there. We have another strip there which is slightly lighter, so we'll deal with that in a second. But we'll go ahead and say, well, there's that green. See what happens. I'm just rinsing the brush here. You're wondering what all these noises are. Okay, it's actually changing the brush. So now let's assume that this tone, it was a wee bit lighter than that. Okay, and let's assume that we keep on following this process from cold to warm. So now we're down here. So we'll look at that color and we'll think, well, let's put that on. It's a little bit lighter anyway. We may not need any white in that. You know, that when I put that green on, it's brighter than that. And it's also richer, so it might be interesting. We'll put it on and see, you know. And this is what I've preached ad nauseum in this video, I'm sure, about letting yourselves experiment a little bit. I'm going to put that on there. I'm going to maybe put the odd little bit of light in here. So I'm beginning to play with the paint. I'm not letting it just become flat. So I'm thinking, well, put a few brush marks and things in, you know, as long as we're generally keeping in with this set of colors to see how that affects things, you know. And then down here, we'll assume this is the lighter and richer, warmer. So we're obviously down at our yellow colors here. Let's put a little light in there and lighten it up a wee bit. And we'll put some of this in here. I know we had blue and things in there. We might go ahead and put that in again later. But generally all I'm doing is a set of colors going from warm to cold and from blue, beg your pardon, to sort of a yellow-green. And we can start adjusting them to fit the way we feel about it. So there's this what we've got there is a very big set of blocks established right away, going from this warm, slightly cooler. What I might do here, I think, well, you know, I feel that's quite warm, you know, it's quite close to that. So maybe what I'll do is I'll bring in some of that cooler green, you see here, pull it over into the slightly mid-green and go in like that. So it's not as yellow, so there's some difference in there. I think that might be quite nice. Again, maybe create a little bit of texture in the grass or whatever that is there, so we're not. So you can see what's happening, that there's a range and natural harmony begin to happen. Now we did have some blue in here, so maybe what I'll do is go back up here and use a little blue. Maybe that's too rich. Maybe something like that, you know. I'll just put it in. We'll see how we get on, you know. That's maybe a bit too blue. So maybe throw in a little of the bluey green in there, because we're not allowing ourselves to add other colors. We're saying this is it. This is what we've got to play with. This is what we've got to work with in this picture. So we'll bang that in, and so we'll have a different color, blue there to there, but it maybe relates better to the green. So hopefully you can see that there's an automatic harmony going on here. What I might do now is, what I forgot was a little bit of cloud here, and that cloud was sort of, we put it in as a sort of purpley color. Well, we don't have purpley color to play with, so what we'll have to do is work with the blue that we had. So maybe what we'll do is we'll take that blue, maybe slightly darker, maybe add a little bit of this green in here just to subdue it. But we want it to be a wee bit deeper than this area, because we had these sort of, as I remember, there were sort of a curve of clouds going on in there. So again, we'll be lively about it as long as we keep using only the colors on our palette here. Bring those little cloudy forms across, maybe onto the horizon there, you know. And the acrylic, as you can imagine, is drying quite quickly, so it's harder to blend this out. I would like that to be a softer blend maybe, but we can work at that. And you can hear the brush rubbing that to try and soften that in a wee bit. But so now we're getting some suggestion that there might be clouds here, and now that makes me feel that this blue maybe could be lighter. Now that I see that, so let's throw in a lot more white to this blue. In fact, it might be virtually just an off-white, to be honest with you. Acrylics have a tendency to be transparent. So as I rub this virtually all white over the top of this blue, the blue comes through. You can see that it's not white anymore. It is actually got a wee bit of blue in there, and that maybe makes the sky a wee bit better compared to these clouds here, you know. Anyway, I'm sort of just getting distracted slightly here, because what I really want to show you is there is a composition created by a range of harmony, an analogous harmony. Okay, so that's what it is. And now when we go back to the little point we talked about earlier, which was how do we play with the amounts of color and things, and how do we throw a little spark in there? So we've got a color harmony that's running from the blues to the yellows, if you like, or yellowy greens. If we go around to the other side of the color wheel, what we'll have is reds and oranges. If you look at the color wheel, the opposite to this range would be kind of a reddish and orange. So if we're very careful, and if I can find my brush again, and we do that, so what I'm going to do is take a little of the yellow. I mean, that's virtually yellow we've got there anyway, but there's a little yellow, pure yellow. You can see the difference there, by the way. I'm going to put a little bit of crimson. Crimson isn't always the greatest for creating orange, but for this exercise, we're going to run with it. What I want to show you is that if I create a little orangey tint here, down at the bottom, it's quite a rusty orange, but that's kind of nice. And if I was then to just introduce occasional little flecks of that, you know, I don't know what these are, I'm just pretending that there may be little bits of grass or something here. You can see immediately, I hope, that those little flashes energize suddenly, boom, this picture takes on a new life because of that small amount of a complementary, the orange playing against the blue there. Likewise, and this is where I might overdo it, if we had red, and be very, very careful with this, a little spot of red somewhere, you can see, let me make it slightly bigger, you can see that tiny bit of red, suddenly it sparks again. If I go too much, if I keep doing this, I'm in danger of creating the same amount of blue, red, yellow, three primaries, which then destroys the whole point of the exercise, which we want a dominant harmony, which is accented with a little of the complements. So that's what's going on there, and that's something really worth exploring. You can go back on these and play with them in all sorts of ways. You can take and paint over these colors. You know, I could take, for example, a slightly, I'm going to try it here, I'm going to dilute the white ever so slightly. I don't know, you can just about see it on the screen there. It's slightly warm white actually, but I'm going to, I know this is dry now, I'm going to rub this transparent white over the top of all of that. And in fact, let's rub it over the back of this as well, all these mountains here. It might take a wee moment or two to dry out, but maybe you can see how that pushes these back into the distance. So suddenly I've used a harmony, but now what I've done is change the key, change the lightness. So I haven't added any more colors to what I've got here. All I'm doing is using the colors I've got here to play with these variations. And I could arguably go on and rub over the blue. And you can see suddenly now how these colours relate. And I suppose if I rubbed over the yellow, get a wee bit more water. Sorry, it's quite crude. And the orange as well, by the way, which is now dry. So suddenly I'm unifying this picture again. I'm pulling it together. I'm giving it a family of colour. All the colours kind of feel like they go together because they've all got this little bit of whiteness rubbed over them. And I could probably do the same in the sky, but I know the sky is wet at the minute. But you can see how I've taken that underneath that haze, but yet there's still a sort of feeling of harmony about the picture. If I was to suddenly introduce, let's say, just for the sake of argument, something like this, suddenly look at that, the picture, something else happens. It's not right. It doesn't feel right because I've suddenly thrown in a variacity colour against these soft colours. So we want all of our colours to have a relationship. They belong, as it were, to the same family. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're working. Here's a little, if you like, extra thing. I just thought about this, so I've restarted the video just to for the sake of it, since I've got these colours here. I thought, well, you know, I keep going on about experimentation and practice what you preach and all that. So I thought, let's see if we take this palette knife and we strengthen some of these colours again. So I'm gonna just take and with a palette knife just to see what we can get here. It will maybe shine a little bit to begin with, but same sort of colour scheme, slightly richer this time, you know. And we'll bring that down there. We'll make that cloud formation, as I say, I've added a little greenish colour into that blue so that this is a little heavier. Okay, we'll put that in there. And if you see paintings by the Impressionists and people like that, they will have green in the sky and blue in the flowers and all sorts of things, you know. I just want to create different texture, just as I say, for the sake of it, you know, and have a bit of fun and at the same time. Let's go down here. We'll get some of that. We'll mix some. I've lost our blue green, so I'm making that up, a wee bit of blue into that green just to change that a little bit. Maybe a little bit of white this time, so you can see that going a little bit more pastely. And put those little marks in here along that line there for this thing here, and then we'll come up and we'll use a slightly warmer green and we'll go back in there, a bit of white in there. So I'm mixing and matching this time. In other words, instead of being very systematic, blue, green, whatever, I'm swapping the colours around. But as I said before, I'm not using any more colours than exist on that palette right now. I'm not going to introduce any other factors, if you like. Let's get into this yellow. Look at that. Throw this on. Let's see. But isn't it interesting that as I do this, even though it seems, and it is quite free and kind of expressive, that there is a natural harmony. You know, we can feel that we're not being jarred by anything that's too outlandish, because we're working with a very limited range of colours. Even if we mix those colours together, they'll always belong to the same family, because we're not spreading out to reds and purples and oranges and maybe even yellows. And so you can see there what's going on with this sort of harmony here. And again, like I did before, I might throw in those little bits of accent of orange, or look at that, maybe a little bit of orange just touched into the clouds here. See that? And maybe up here and maybe over there. So it's the orange can go into the green as long as we don't overdo it. And we've turned the green to an orangey green, but at least, as I say, it's all within the same family of colour. Just one more thing is maybe that we talked about the Impressionists putting other colours in the sky, and I think, well, why not do this? Since I've got the last dregs of this, I'm going to mix up 2 or 3 colours so they're not, the sky isn't purely blue, you know. So we bring the sky into even a tighter harmony with the lower part of the picture here. So we create that, and it becomes an expressive picture, a picture that maybe has a mood that it didn't have before. And depending on how dark and light, we can change that mood. So, for example, I'm going to throw on some more blue. You can see I'm getting carried away now. But if I take that blue, this very intense blue, let's get a bit of green in there. So it's not pure blue, but it's going to be a darkish blue-green. And then say, well, what if we put some of those little bits in there, like, you know, what if we darken that horizon, and likewise maybe with the color beside it here, maybe it becomes bluer, so it becomes closer to the sky color. So we can decide that we don't need it to be blue to green to yellow. We can maybe change that too, but you can see that as I make that closer to the same color as the sky, the mood changes, the illusion of distance changes also. And if I do the same with the remaining of this yellowy color, so in other words, instead of bright yellow, it becomes slightly paler, colder color so I'm getting rid of a lot of the yellows there, just to see what goes on there, look. And look, the paint is merging together, you know. All the shapes are beginning to merge into, like, you know, a haziness, which is also exciting as well, you know. So now there is a feel, there's an atmosphere in that picture. Yeah, we've lost some of the accuracy of the drawing, but likewise, we've gained color harmony and mood. So, as all the best people say, this is one I did earlier, okay? What I've done is simply made a little sketch using a different set of analogous harmony. In other words, I went with purple to purple red to red orange, that sort of range, which is kind of different from the previous image. And you can see what I've been doing here. The purples are up in the sky here, the reds and the red oranges down here. So what I did then, or what I have done, is go again to the other side of the color wheel and pick out a few accents. So I went over to the green end and dropped a little tiny bits of green in there, and likewise a little bit of stronger blue, but in tiny amounts. Too much of that, then the whole thing becomes very confused. So it's predominantly that purple orangey sort of color, and simply accented by the other complements, if you like. Now what I want to do, just again as an experiment, is if we take one section of this little sketch and say, let's make it neutral, as in so neutral that it's hard to say what color that is. So it's a gray, if you like. So what I'm doing, I'm over on my palette, I'm mixing red, blue and yellow together, which when you mix all three primaries, you get a very mucky, you will get a mucky gray color. And I might add a little bit of white to it. I don't know if we can actually see this here. If I slide it over, maybe you can see what I'm doing. Here I am, and here you can see the grayness of that. I'd like to have it a little bit darker just for the sake of it, you know. And let's say I drop that in over here. And I really don't know for sure what's going to happen, but I'm going to neutralize this little mountain area here, this little hill that I've painted here. I'm going to make that one area of neutral and dark. So obviously it changes the mood of the picture right away. It also gives us some relief from the fact that there was so much orange, red, pink. So we can begin with a harmony and then drop in neutral colors which give it a break. In other words, it's a bit like having a wee bit of quiet in between loud music. It's a nice relief. It gives you a rhythm. It doesn't seem like you're being bombarded by the whole thing. So you can see how that is having an effect. Just that simple change on the whole color scheme as a whole. Suddenly the warms that were here are shining out a bit more because they're divided by this neutral, and the warms that are here are more noticeable. Whereas maybe previously it was all warm. But that depends on what you want and what mood you want to create and what harmony you want to create.